Hello, this is the Bite Weasel, and in this video we'll be fixing up our existing screen UI, as well as adding a new settings window that we can use to control the volume of our sounds and music. So at some point, we spent a little bit of time adding sounds and music into our game under the sound service. And we did it using these sound groups, and we talked about how we wanted the user to be able to control the volume. And so to do that, we're going to need a brand new sort of settings window that has a couple of sliders on there that allow the user to specify how loud they want their effects and how loud they want their music to be. To do that, we're going to need to add some new UI. And we already have some existing UI right here. So under our screen GUI sort of starter GUI area, we sort of have these labels and icons that track currently how much money you have in the game and how many products you've ever sold. That's the only UI we have right now. So we're going to need a new button that allows us to show a settings UI when it gets pressed, and then we're going to need the actual settings UI. So where are we going to put this button on our current screen? I think I want it kind of here above our currently tracked things. So to do that, I'm going to add a brand new sort of container frame, and I'm going to call it UI frame, I guess. And I'm going to put my existing stuff in that frame. And now I'll be able to have a UI frame in my screen GUI, and then later on a settings window frame, completely separate. And that sort of separates how these things work. Now, of course, this right now is in a really bizarre position. I want it sort of in the center of the screen, maybe down there, and I probably want it a bit bigger. So to do that, let's make sure the anchor point is set to about halfway down. Our position is then set to sort of halfway down the screen. And our size is, oh, I don't know, zero point 0.2 by 0.2. That looks about right, actually. Maybe we want it a bit longer. And once you've sort of set an initial size using the relative values here, you can sort of use your mouse to then update it a little bit. So that's not bad. We'll turn off the background by turning up the transparency. And then we will add a new frame under here where we're going to store all of our clickable buttons. So I'll call it, I don't know, controls. And under that controls, we'll add a new image button and we'll call it settings button. And that will be our settings button. Now, right now, everything is, of course, really poorly positioned. So what we're going to do is want to click all of those to select them and make sure that at least their sizes are relatively correct. So probably all the way across with a 1 and maybe 0.25 of the container. Then, of course, this settings button is not right. So we'll want it about, 0.1 by 1, which sort of fits in that controls area now. And I wish the default for a frame had no background on it because I'm always having to change that. So right now, they look like this inside our new container that we just made. And obviously the layout looks a bit bad. Now the sizes are okay. They're not great, but the sizes are all right. The problem is the position is bad. And we could go through and we could sort of go down to the position and we could sort of manually set it over and over again for each one slightly differently. But I want to show you a different way of doing it. And that is by adding a new thing to our UI frame. If I press the little plus button here and I type the letters UI, you'll see a list of all these sort of special behaviors you can add to any screen container. And we sort of used some of these before, like the UI stroke sort of gives a border to things, and we've used that a couple of times on labels. And the UI corner gives rounded corners to things, and we sort of use that in these terrible icons over here. But there is another one that you can use, which is called a layout. And there's a couple to choose from. There's a UI list layout, the grid layout, and the page layout. And if you sort of add one of these to a container, it basically tells Roblox to, hey, I want you to automatically control the layout and position of all of my children elements. So we've added it to this UI frame, and immediately it's sort of listed out these three children and set their position automatically one underneath the other. So if I look at one of these now, you'll see that the position has this warning icon which says, hey, the position of this is overridden by your special behavior, the UI list layout. And that's really handy because it means I don't have to go through and sort of manually update these things. Instead, I can just have that automatically position it for me. And now I can add stuff in and set its size however I want, but the position is taken care of. Now, right now, it looks a bit odd because at the top, we used to have our money, but now the product sold is at the top. So what we need to do is specify what order we want these things to be laid out in by using the layout order property. So for our frame, which I guess is really our money frame, let's just sort of update that. And then our sold frame, I don't want it to actually track products sold anymore. I want it to track that thing that we added last episode, like how many rebirths we have, because that's a little more interesting to the user than how many products they've ever sold. We'll still track how many products we've ever sold in our data store in case we want to add a leaderboard or something. But for the user, they want to know how many rebirths they've had because that sort of affects their multiplier and gameplay. So we're going to track that instead. But let's update these layout orders. We want controls to actually be first, so we can leave that as 0. We want money to be next, and we want rebirth to be last. So you see by changing that layout order, it sort of picked the order in which these things sort of get positioned. And now I think the position looks good, but I want to make it just a little bigger. So that looks a little better, but I think these icons are really, really bad. So let's bite the bullet and actually just grab some from the toolbox. So if we head on over to our home and then toolbox, we can search for something like an icon pack. And one of the ones that I found here, although there are a bunch to choose from, is called the Flipbook Icons Pack. And I think they look pretty cool. Now, one thing you've noticed when I've clicked this is that Roblox has given us a warning that we haven't seen before. And it says, watch out because the Flipbook Icon Pack includes one script. And you should review the scripts because they could cause unwanted changes to your experience. So this is a very good security warning from Roblox. I advise never clicking the don't show this again because it's really handy to know when something you've added from the toolbox contains a script. Because then you know you need to go through that script and check to see what it's doing. Is it doing what you expected? Right? Because if you add something like a tree model from the toolbox into your game and it comes with scripts, you need to be a bit suspicious because it's a tree model. Why does that have scripts? If you add something like a pet system, it's less suspicious because, of course, the pet system needs scripts to actually work. So this is a great warning because it's telling me, hey, I need to go and look through this thing to see what the scripts are doing. Now, in this case, we can see that the script is actually just a README, and it basically tells us that it's made by the Bacon, who is the person who made this, and you can check out their YouTube channel, which I advise you to do if you use this icon pack, and their Discord channel is there too. But we can see that the script doesn't really do anything. It just has these comments in, and then it prints made by the Bacon was here. So this isn't doing anything malicious, but you can imagine some scripts in the toolbox might get added to your game and do something malicious. Like they could change all the IDs of your Robux identifiers so that instead of buying stuff from your game, people end up buying stuff from their game. So all the Robux you could have earned go to them instead of you. That would be terrible. So if you are worried, you can just delete scripts and then they're guaranteed never to run. And so that is a way to be a bit safer. But unless you know what you're doing, I advise you to be very careful of allowing stuff from the toolbox with a script into your game. But look at these things. Look at these icons now. Aren't they really cool? Let's borrow some for our game. So I'm going to use the coin icon here. And I'm going to copy that and I'm going to paste it into a brand new sort of image label so that we can use that as our icon for money instead of that terrible thing that we had before. So we'll turn on the transparency and we'll sort of copy these positions and sizes from the old icon to what is now our new icon. And the last thing is probably the anchor point, which wants to be halfway down. So now it's in that position. We can delete the old one. We can rename this icon. We can copy it and we can paste it in here and remove that. Now for our rebirth icon, I want to use what they've called rebirth yellow because I think that one looks good. So we'll do that. We'll paste it in here. And for our settings icon, I'm going to use their gear icon, which I think also looks really good. So kudos to the guy who made this. We are borrowing them for now, but definitely go check out their YouTube channel if you end up using these icons yourself. So that looks good. Again, it's got background color on it. Why is that the default as 0? I want it to default to be 1 all the time. Now that looks okay, but these icons are a bit sort of funny shape now. So what you can do is you can go down into the scale type and change it from stretch, which means fit the size of my container no matter what it does to the image. And instead of stretch, you can choose fit, which says fit it to the size of the container, but at least keep it the sort of same shape that it was before. So that looks a lot better. And we can sort of make it the same size as that and just update our relative scale to fill up all the way instead. So that looks good now. These are a little far away from the icons, so we can move those over there. But other than that, it looks a lot better now, I think, with this icon pack. So we're done with it for now. We can just sort of delete it out of the tree. And there we go. Doesn't that look pretty neat? Now you can spend a lot more time than I am on doing this, and you can even change stuff like the UI list layout, padding, for example. Maybe you want them really far apart. Maybe you don't. A little bit of padding on there looks good. And you can sort of do that on your game so it looks pretty neat. But there we go. We have a position for our settings button now, and we have some nicer icons for our coin, which means money, and our rebirth icon that we're going to change in a minute to actually track the rebirth count. One final thing that I want to do here is add something that is also a special behavior, and it's called a UI aspect ratio constraint. And I'm going to show you why I want to add that. So right now, with the way that I've set this up, if you end up joining the game on a different device that isn't exactly this shape, the UI could get a bit messed up. So let me show you what I mean by that. If I go to the toolbox again, for example, and sort of change the shape of my window by, making it really big. So this looks kind of like the shape of a phone now. You can see that the icons have got really, really small, but the text labels are really the same size as they were before. So this kind of looks funny on a phone, right? So a way to fix that is instead of having things scale individually like they do right now, you can add this thing called a UI aspect ratio constraint, which makes everything sort of work like the image fit setting in that it will resize stuff all together but keep the same sort of aspect ratio or shape that it had before. So you need to, when you add one of these things, go into your aspect ratio and sort of set it to what the aspect ratio is you're currently designing for. So basically, how wide is the screen compared to how high it is when you're designing these things? So for me, when I've designed this thing, I'd say the aspect ratio is like 2.87, which means the screen here is 2.87 times wider than it is high. And you can sort of change this depending on how you've set your window as you've designed it, right? It sort of looks something like this, and you can go away and you can spend a bit more time figuring out what that looks like. But now, if I change the size of this sort of screen, it's all going to look correct instead of some things being small, some things being big. And you can sort of prove that by going over to this test tab and clicking this device button that we've never used before. And if I click this, what it does is it sort of emulates the size of different device screens. And you can see here, even though it's really tiny, and maybe you can't see it on the video, but it's actually all the same sort of shape as it was before. And you can test what it would look like then on an iPad Pro, sorry, an iPad 2, or a Samsung tablet, or, whichever, an iPhone 4. And you see these look pretty good. Because we've added the aspect ratio constraint, it means everything's sort of resized together and you don't end up with wonky looking UI if someone joins on a really old phone. So that's a handy thing to know about, is this device test tab. But I think now we've got a good looking UI. Right. So let's add now what we're going to show, which is our settings window, when someone presses this new settings button. So we're going to add a new frame. We're going to call it settings. And we're basically going to position it in the middle of the window. And I'm going to take some time sort of making it look good and having a couple of slider controls on here that the user can press. Now that's going to take me quite a while, and I don't think you want to watch me fiddle around with numbers in the video. So I'm going to cut the video here and come back when I've done that. So welcome back, and this is what I managed to come up with. And I think this is pretty nice. Let me show you what I have inside my settings frame here so that you can sort of make it something similar when you come to your game, if you like the look of this. Otherwise, you can spend time and make an even better one for your game. But basically what I've got is another one of those aspect ratio constraints in here, so that if I join on a phone or something, this is still going to look good. Then I've got this actual background of my window, which is basically just a white frame with a UI corner to give it curved corners and a UI stroke to sort of give it that tiny border there. Then I copied and pasted that, and I got rid of the stroke so there's no border, and then I just sort of rotated it a little bit by setting its rotation to be -4, and that sort of gives this cool abstract background effect on there. And if you're curious why one is shown in front of the other, and that is because of this thing called the Z index or Z index, depending on where you come from. And that is what determines the render order of these things. So background, which is the white piece, is actually higher Z index or Z index than the background tilt is. So if I was to change this and set it to be a high number, you'd see this one is now rendered in front. So it's important, if you want something to be rendered behind something else, to make sure you make use of this property here. And lower numbers get rendered first, so they're in the background. Higher numbers get rendered after. So we have that background, and we have the title of the window here, which just is a string called settings, and I've sort of angled it the same as the background. You can probably see it's -4 as well. And that is basically what you would change if you copied and pasted this frame to make something else, like an inventory or a tutorial window or a pet system or something. You would change the the title from settings to be whatever the window was. So that's neat. Then I've added a button frame that contains, rounded corners and a border, and then inside an actual button with a gradient. That's what it looks like. Now inside that button, because I'm using a gradient and a corner, I sort of had to add a manual label inside. Without that manual label, just sort of setting the text on this button looks a bit wonky. So instead, the button has no actual text on it. You see it's empty here, and I have a text label inside instead, so that I can set the stroke and it's not picking up the gradient and stuff from the actual button. So that's something to be aware of if you want a nice gradient on your button. And then the other thing I have are these two settings, which are just text labels for music and FX volume, and then the actual cool things, these sliders. And the sliders are actually really, really simple. They're just a really thin frame that I colored blue with a slightly bigger text button on it that is darker blue and has no text. So these buttons are going to be the things that you drag around to set the volume for your game. But I think that looks pretty cool. So that's my settings window, and it took me quite a while to make it. And you didn't want to watch me fiddle around with numbers because it took a long time. But that's what it looks like. So next, we're going to get into the actual coding of making sure that when you press this settings button, this window shows up. When you press this OK button, it sort of closes down, and the user can drag these things around to not only set the value on these sound groups, but also store it and reload it from our data profile service so that the next time the player comes to the game, their volume settings are still the same. So let's take a look at what that would look like next. So the first thing that we need to do is actually update some of these references that we changed. Right, so let's head on over to our client GUI script, which controls all of that stuff, and now update these money labels and sold labels, which doesn't even exist anymore, to the new layout that we have here. So the first thing that we want to do is grab access to this UI frame, and we can call that UI frame, which is basically our container off of the GUI, which, if you recall, is the starter GUI thing here. We need to wait for the child called screen GUI, and from that, we'll wait for the child called UI frame. And now the money label is actually the UI frame, and then waiting for the child called money frame, and then waiting for the child called money, which is the actual text label itself. And then there's no such thing as a sold label anymore. It is, in fact, a rebirth label, which is going to be the UI frame, waiting for the rebirth frame, followed by the actual rebirth text label itself, which is this over here. So now inside this event handler, which gets called whenever the server updates the profile data, we need to update our rebirth label. And we can simply do that by changing this to rebirth label and grabbing from our data there the rebirth count, which we're actually doing already here, but we don't need to print that anymore. So now this will be updated with the rebirth count on the UI, but inside our data script, we're still actually tracking that product sold in case we want to use it in the future. But the data is coming through for rebirth count, and that is what we're updating our text label with. So that deals with those two things that changed. Now we need to hook into this button so that when you press it, this window appears. So to do that, we're going to need two new references. We're going to need a reference to the actual button that you click, and then a reference to that window frame that sort of shows up when you click it. So we can say local settings button. So together that button is going to be the screen GUI, UI frame, controls, setting button. So very similar to this thing up here, but instead of waiting for the money frame, it's waiting for the controls followed by settings button. And then to get access to what I'm going to call the settings window is very similar, except it's going to be the screen GUI, which is this, followed by the settings, which is the name of the settings window frame. Now that's really simple. How do we get the button to actually do something when you click it? Well, there's a whole bunch of different events on these buttons to do with clicking. And this is the most important one that we'll be using, the mouse button one click. Now, if you use mouse button one click, Roblox is actually clever enough to convert this into a touch signal if you're not using a mouse. So if you're connecting to your game on an iPad or something, as long as you've used mouse button one click, this will still work when they touch the screen, even if they don't have a mouse. That doesn't, however, work if you use like mouse button 2 or one of the middle clicks or anything. It only really works if you use mouse button 1, as far as I'm aware. So that's what we're going to do, and we're going to listen to that click event by connecting to it. adding a new function, and then doing something inside. And Roblox has suggested the exact code that we want, which is when they click the settings button, we're going to take the settings window and change the visible property to be the opposite of whatever the current visible property is. So this is basically going to toggle the window. If it's set to false, this will turn it to true, and if it's set to true, this will turn it to false. So now I think we can actually just test that right away. And now if I click this settings button, you'll see the settings window appears, which is actually really nice. With very little code, we've got that working. So next, I actually want to make sure that whenever I start the game, the settings window is not visible, right? I'm going to set that to false. So now when I start the game, even if I've forgotten to set it to false in the hierarchy, when someone joins, they won't see that immediately. But they can toggle it open here, and they can toggle it closed here. I'd actually want them to also close it if they click this OK button. So we could hook up that in the exact same way. We'll get a reference to it. We can say local OK button equals, and then this time it's going to be the settings window. If we expand this, we can take a look, followed by the button frame, followed by the OK button. So wait for child button frame, followed by wait for child button, OK button, right? And we can actually just hook up the exact same code here. We can say OK button, and when they click it, set the window to be hidden, so visible false. We don't really want to toggle it with that OK button, not that we could anyway, because it has to be visible for them to be able to click it. But now we can open it with here, and we can close it with here, or we can close it with the settings button again. And I think that's good. You could do something special in the OK button, like this you could treat as a save, and if you do this, it kind of cancels it. That's an option for your game, but for me, we're just going to do the exact same thing on either button. So that's nice. Now all we need to do is make these sliders work. You can see they're already buttons, so my cursor sort of changes over the top to know that I can press them, but if I drag them around, nothing happens. So this is going to be slightly more complicated because we're going to have to listen to a few events. We're going to have to listen to some sort of down event, like I'm clicking it and holding, and then we're going to have to listen to some sort of move event, right? And then update the position of these things based on that movement, and then based on those positions, update the value of these sound service volume things. So what would that look like in the code? The first thing that we're going to want to think about is how to structure this code, because we know we'll have multiple of these things, right? We've got at least two sliders, a music slider and an FX slider, and maybe in the future we'll have even more. We could put all of that in this single client GUI script that we already have, but we also might want to use sliders in other games, right? So it might be handy if we just use a brand new module script. And we'll want sort of a function in that module script that says here, given this frame in the hierarchy, turn it into a cool slider control. Much like in our helpers module script, we have this cool function called create button that turns a physical thing in the hierarchy into one of these cool chunky buttons that works correctly by waiting to stand on it and then moves the part down and all of that good stuff with this sort of complicated code. So we can do something very similar on our client side. The helper stuff runs on the server side, so we can create a brand new function inside a module script on the client side. So inside player scripts, we can create a new module script and call it something like UI controls. So we could call it sliders, but maybe we're going to add more types of controls later on. So in here, we're going to want to expose to whoever uses this script a function called create slider. Much like we saw in the helper script, there was a function that was called create button. This one's going to be called create slider, and it's going to take in a frame that must have a thumb text button inside it, which is exactly the shape of our current controls here. So music slider is a frame with a thumb button inside. So that's cool. Now, what do we want to do when someone creates a slider? Well, I think we're going to want to hook into them pressing the thumb button, right? So we're going to take the frame dot thumb and we're going to listen to a event. Now, we've listened to the click button before, and that's really when you press down the mouse button and let it go as one click, down and up. We really want them to hold it down. So the way you do that is you, instead of listening for a whole click, you listen to half a click, which is really the down part. So this will fire the function as soon as the mouse button is down, instead of waiting for them to release it as well. So we can listen to that by connecting to it. And now what do we want to do in here? Well, we probably want to just set some sort of flag that says, hey, the guys are currently dragging this slider around. So we can create a new sort of local variable here. We'll call it active slider. And we'll set the active slider to be, this frame that they happen to be clicking on. So when they click on the first one, it will set the active slider to FX slider. And when they click on the music slider, instead, it will be the music slider. And you can only ever have one of these things, right? You can only ever have one mouse pointer, so you can't click on both at the same time. So this is going to be really good. So now we want a way of figuring out, okay, we know that they've pressed down on something, but how do we know when they move the mouse left and right while something is down? Well, there is another event on buttons that's called something like mouse move. Let's see if we can find it here. Yeah, mouse moved. So we could listen to that, but the problem is that only fires if your cursor is still on the button. And if you go over here and you sort of imagine me holding down this button, trying to slide it, I might accidentally go down here, and I'd still expect it to move as long as I was still holding down my mouse button. So mouse moved is not going to work for us. Instead, we need something that will work no matter if the cursor is over a button or not. And the way that you can do that in Roblox is to use a thing called the user input service. So much like a bunch of other services that we've seen before, this one, however, controls and has a whole bunch of information for user input things. So touch events, mouse events, things like that. So we can say game get service, user input service. And the user input service has a thing on it that we'll want. And that thing is called input changed. And this is fired when anything sort of changes. So whether you've moved the mouse at all, whether you've started touching something, whether you've clicked, whether you've let go of a click, all sorts of different things. So this fires a lot. It's very similar to the heartbeat that we talked about before. You want to make sure that anything you write in this happens kind of fast, right? Because you don't want it to hang around doing a lot of work every time input changes, because this happens a whole bunch. But you do get this nice input object parameter passed in, and that you can use to determine what has changed, like what input has moved, what input has stopped clicking, and things like that. So we'll be using that. But the first thing that we want to do is say, if there's not an active slider, then return. So this immediately gets out of the function if we're not doing anything to do with sliders. So this will make it nice and performant because we're not blocking anything else if there's no slider, right? If they're not pressing on a slider, don't bother calculating anything because it's just a waste of time. So next, we sort of need to position the thumb text button based on where the mouse pointer currently is, right? I think that makes sense. So once they've held down the mouse button, we set active slider to true, and then whenever the input changes, so moving left and right, then we want to actually update the thumb button. So we can get the mouse position by looking at the user input service again and saying get mouse location. And that will give us sort of the location of the mouse as it currently stands. And then we need to calculate where that position is compared to the slider. And that is where our thumb button should get moved to. So what is the relative position of the mouse compared to the slider? We can say the mouse position minus the slider, which is actually the active slider, dot absolute position. So the problem is I'm not getting any IntelliSense because it doesn't know the active slider is this. So you've seen me do this before. I'm going to take this and create a new type. I'm going to call it slider frame type. I'm going to make it equal to that. And then I'm going to say my active slider is of type slider frame type, and this takes in a slider frame. So now I should be able to say dot absolute position. There it is. So now we have a relative position between the mouse and where our slider is. But we need to calculate how much of a percent that is along the width of that slider bar, right? Otherwise, we're going to end up with the thumb button sliding all the way off the end of the slider bar, which we don't really want. So what does the percent look like? And that's really going to be the relative position that we just calculated's x value, because we don't really care about up and down because it's a horizontal slider, divided by, the size of the slider. So how far along the slider are we? Which is the active slider dot absolute size. And sizes have an x and a y, so we want the x position. So that's really cool, but that is only going to give us a percentage of where the mouse pointer is relative to the width. We need to actually stop it sliding off the side. And we can do that with this function built in called clamp. So math has a whole bunch of different things on it. I think this is a Lua global object. And it has a bunch of helpers here. And one of them is called clamp. And you can send it in a number and then a min and a max. And it will sort of return out to you that number, but it will never be lower than this and it will never be higher than this one. So we can say clamp the relative position that we've calculated between 0 and 1. So we never go off the beginning and we never go further than the end of the slider. And then at that point, we know exactly where that slider is supposed to be. So we can say slider.thumb.position equals basically this percentage value, right? But the problem is positions are a special thing in Roblox. They're not just a number. They're actually a thing called a udim2, which I guess stands for some sort of user dimension 2. I'm not entirely sure. But you have to create one of these, and they're very similar to vectors if you know about them. But they allow you to pass in the sort of x and y position for something. But for each x and y, you can have a relative size and a pixel size. So we really want to use the first sort of value, which is the scale or relative size of something, and then no pixel offset. Like we don't care about that. And for the y, we actually want it to be whatever the current y is, right? We don't actually want to change the y at all. So we can say active slider dot thumb dot position dot y dot scale. And then for the offset, we know it's always going to be 0. We could also take the offset from this. Maybe we should do that. It doesn't really matter that much. But there you go. That is going to move our thumb wherever the mouse pointer is relative to the slider's position. And then when we let go, we actually want to stop having an active slider. So whenever we let go, we can use another user input service thing called input ended. And we can connect to that with a new function, which again, I think is given a, whoa, that's not what I wanted, an input event that you can query if you need to. But we're really just going to say, well, if there's not an active slider, then return because we don't care. Otherwise, we're going to set the active slider to be nothing. Now, in theory, this should work. If someone called create slider, we should hook up the mouse down button, and when they click it, we set an active slider. And now when we move, if there is an active slider, we position the thumb relative to where it is on the slider. And then when they let go, we stop having an active slider. So should we try it? Well, we need something to call it first. So back in our client GUI script, we need to actually get access to that module script. So I think we call it UI controls, and it's going to be on the game get service. Was it player script service? Something like that. Let's take a look. Starter player. So starter player, and then from there, we will wait for a child called starter player scripts. And from there, we will wait for the child called UI controls. And we have to actually require that module script by wrapping all of that nonsense in a require. And now, if we grab access to that slider, 1 or 2, well, either one. We'll start with the FX slider, I guess. So we will say the settings window. Sorry, we'll say the local FX slider equals the settings window, wait for child, and then it's just called FX slider. And since we're here, we might as well get the music slider. And grabbing that, it's called music slider. And then we can sort of create those controls by saying UI controls dot create slider, passing in the FX slider for one, and I guess we will pass in the music slider for the other. Now that should have added all of those input services and hooking up events and stuff. Let's try it out. So we start the game, settings window is hidden, we can click this to show it, and now in theory, if I hold down this button and move it, you'll see it's working. And I can't go off the beginning and I can't go further than the end. And if I let go, it stops moving. How cool was that? We're basically getting the mouse position relative to where the cursor is and then moving the thumb along that track. Really nice. Now we just need it to actually do something when you move these values around. So how can we get that to work? Well, we essentially want to tell something that, hey, this value has changed and the new percent, like how far along the slider between 0 and 1, is this. So we're actually needing to control two separate things though, right? We need to control an FX slider and a music slider, both of which are going to want to do slightly different things with that number. So I think what we should do is we should take in a callback function, and we can call it like update. So whenever the value changes, we want to be given a function that sort of returns nothing, right? But that function is given a number. So I don't know if you've seen this sort of structure before as a type, but it basically describes a callback type. So instead of it being like a frame with children, if you wrap something in round brackets like this and give it an arrow symbol, it sort of means that this parameter will be a function type. So it will be a function that takes a parameter that is a number, and the function will return nothing. So we're going to take that, and we need to set and store this somewhere. So let's sort of store it on this active slider thing. So what we can do is we can take this type and we can make a new type and we'll call it slider callback, right? That's going to be the type and it's going to look like this kind of function. And so we can update this so it takes in one of those. And then we'll say our active slider is actually going to be a table with the slider, that is the frame, and the update, I guess, which is of type callback. And add a comment there. So now our active slider isn't actually the frame itself. It's now a table that contains a bunch of stuff that we can store. So we can say, slider is the frame and the update callback is going to be that update that they pass in. So that's cool, but now this code is broken. because active slider isn't actually a thing. So we'll say local slider equals the active slider table dot the slider frame itself, right? And now instead of saying active slider, we'll say slider, which is the frame itself, and update all of those things. And that should still then work. All we've done is we've moved it into a table here, and now we have somewhere to store this slider callback. So what we can say is now when it's moved, we can say active slider dot update, and because it's a function, it already filled that in for us, and it knows that we need to pass in a number. So what number will we pass in? Well, the percent value, so between 0 and 1 of where the thumb is along that slider. Neat. But now our create slider function needs a new thing passed in. So back in our client GUI, we can say, okay, we're going to pass in a function that is given the value, I guess, that's a number. And when this happens, yeah, that's a good test. We can pass in print fx value. We'll just sort of copy that. We'll change it to music. And now when I move the slider, we should see a bunch of stuff appear in our output window. Let's take a look. And you can see it's working. So as I move this, we're calling that callback and we're setting it as a value to really, really close to one side and really, really close to 0 at the other side. Actually, it is 1. I'm looking at the wrong thing. It's repeated over and over again, and it does hit 0 at this side. And about halfway along, it's about 0.5, exactly what you'd expect. And that number is cool because we can use it to set this value directly, right? This volume directly is a number between 0 and 1. So we can go back to here, and instead of printing the value, what we can do is grab access to that sound group. And I think we have that sound group over here. So we'll sort of copy this code a little bit. We'll grab access to the sound service, and from the sound service, we'll get access to the effects, and we'll get access to the music, much like we did in the place where we use and fire those sounds. So there we go. We have sound effects and we have sound musics. And those are the sound groups. So you can literally say sound group dot volume equals that value that we got passed in. And the same with this sound music. So now if I test it again and I look at that sound group, you should see this volume number changing. So when I move the FX, you'll see we're now controlling the volume of this sound group. And with this music, it's the same. And if I change this one, the music isn't going to change because we have a separate callback that only works when you move the music one around. So that's nice. One thing that I do want to point out about these sound groups, though, is it turns out that if you have a sound under a sound group, it doesn't actually get automatically given the sound group as its sound group. You'd think that it would, but it actually doesn't. So you need to click all of these and sort of set them to be that sound group, right? And so we can go music and we can set that one to be that as the sound group. Now the volume of those things will actually change when you change the volume of this. So that's very important. Sound groups aren't automatically assigned even though the sound is under it. You need to manually set that in your hierarchy. But now we have some nice working code. We can create a slider and pass it in a frame, which is of that particular type, has a thumb on it. And now when they hold down and move, the code sort of calculates that position and sends an update. And that is really nice. Next, we need to actually save that value. Because look, if I start again and I look at this, oh, everything's set back to 0. That is not what I want. In fact, I also want to have a default value of like 0.5. So what we can do is inside our data script, which is where we store all of that profile information, we can add some new sort of values here. And we can say music volume equals 0.5, like that's going to be our default. And we can have FX volume also equal to 0.5. And so now if those change, we'll fire events, which is fine, but we don't expect the server to change them. But we do want the server to store them into the profile service like database, right, when we're finished. So we can load those back out. So those will automatically come down um, whenever a data update happens. So what we could do is grab access to those sliders and set them equal to the value that comes from the data. So what would that look like? Well, it would look something like grabbing access to those sliders, which I think we already have right here. And it would say, slider dot thumb dot position equals, and then if you recall, we had to do that bizarre thing with a udim2, whatever that is, to set the actual position relative to wherever it is on the slider frame. So we'll create one of these things, and instead of percent, it's going to be data dot fx volume, right? And then it's also going to be the fx sliders thumb position, y offset, and the scale. And very similar to this, the music slider is going to be that thumb position there, but it's going to be the music volume, of course, coming from the data, and it's going to change the music slider's position. So now that should have a default value of 0.5, and that's really good, but we only really want to set that once, right? We don't really want to have it going to the server whenever we move these things, and then that causing an event to come back, which also moves these things. We only really need that default value once. So we can add a simple flag in here to just say, hey, have we ever loaded this data before? And if we have, then just ignore it. So we'll say, is data initialized equals false? And the first time it comes in, we will set data is initialized to true. And then up here, we'll say, if not data initialized, then do all of this stuff, right? In fact, we can even just move this in here because you only need to change it when it's false. So now this will only happen once. And when we update the value, we can send a message to the server to say, hey, store this new value. But we need to be careful because currently this update function is called over and over and over and over again. Look, as I move this, the actual sound service value is changing as I move. So this is creating millions and millions of sort of events as I move. Now that's really okay on the client when I'm just firing a function from one client script to another client script. It's not going to have much of performance impact. But if I start telling the server about every single one of these tiny changes, that could have a network impact. So I think the easiest way to fix that is to basically update this callback. So right now, this gets called every time you move left and right over and over again. Why don't we pass in a second value that says, is this the final update? Have they finally let go of the button? And if they have finally let go of the button, then we tell the server. Otherwise, we don't bother. And that's going to be pretty straightforward. We basically update this slider callback function to say, we can actually give these a name. The first parameter is going to be the value, and then we can add a second parameter on here that's sort of true or false. That means, is this the final value because they've let go of the button? And then when we call this update callback, we can say false in here because the input is changing. They're still holding down the button, going left and right. So this is not the final value. But then when they finally let go, we can fire this exact same thing, but say true. This is the final value. They finally let go of the button. Now you can update the server. Unfortunately, it doesn't know what percent is, but I think the quickest way to fix that is to just store it into our table. So we can say that there is a current value in our table, and whenever it changes, we can sort of set that to be the latest percent value, and then we can fire that from our update. Now inside our callback, we basically get a second value here that is final. And when this is true, they've let go of the button, so we should update the server. So it kind of looks like this. We will always update the volume so that they can hear it as they're moving up and down. But then once they let go, we can say, if is final, then do something special, right? And we do that here, and we do that here. But what special item do we want to happen when it is final? Well, we need to tell the server about something. And I don't think we've actually sent a message yet from the client to the server. All of our messages so far have been from the server to the client. So how can we do that? Well, the way that you send messages between the two is you need one of these remote events. We already have 3 of them, but they all go from the server to the client. So we could make a new one that goes from the client to the server. But the good thing about remote events is they can actually go both ways. You can send messages from the server to the client as well as from the client to the server using one remote event. And either side gets different handlers so you know which direction the message went in. And we already have a nicely named data update. And that's really what we want the server to do. We want the server to update its profile data. So why don't we just reuse this one? So we can grab access to that by saying replicated storage, wait for child, data update, and then you can call fire server, which is right here. And much like when you call fire client, you want to pass in any sort of parameters, and then Roblox sends those over the network and you get them on the other side. So we want to sort of send the server, hey, I want you to update this part of the data profile. And that's going to be either FX volume or music volume. So we can pass in FX volume, and the value that I want you to set it to is, whatever the value is. And then down here, we can say music volume, and the value is going to be whatever the music value is. So now we've sent a message from the client to the server. We just need the server to listen to that message and do something with it. So if we head on over to our factory script, we can sort of add a handler very similar to how we're listening to these other sorts of events, but we will listen to it for the server. So we'll go replicated storage.data update dot on server event. That's the name of the event that triggers when the server gets a message from the client. And you can connect to it just like you would any other sort of event. Now, the way that it works on the server when getting a message is you will always get a player variable as your first parameter. So even though you don't actually send the player from your firing script right here, we're not actually sending player. When it gets to the other side, Roblox has added a player variable in there so that you know which client this message came from. Because you only have one server, but you can have many, many clients. This is how you identify which client sent you that message. Then the other things are just, whatever you set. So we're going to say one's a message and one is some sort of value, right? The interesting thing about this is that you should never assume the type of variable that comes in to the server. And the reason for that is any events that come from the client could actually be altered by malicious people. So if some person has a malicious client, they've added some sort of exploit, they can control any message that their client sends to the server. So one thing you don't want to do is assume that this is always going to be only data that you've given and then do something like, data.profile message equals value. That would work for us, right? Because we're sending in music volume and we want the value to be 1. So this would be great. But then a malicious person ends up sending in something like the message being, money and the coin, the value being this. And now without any sort of validation on these parameters, we've suddenly set the money in the profile to be, what is that? Like 100 billion or whatever that is. So you need to be very careful about messages coming into the server that you verify these values are what you expect. So we can do that here, basically with more guard conditions that we've used before. So if there's not a player, then return early. Then we'll try and grab the profile equals data.get for the player. And of course, whoops, if there is not a player profile, then return early. Otherwise, we're about to sort of get and act on our parameters. So the first thing we want to do is check that this message is actually a message that we expect. So we can say if type of, this lets us know the actual type of the underlying value that we're looking at, is not equal to a string, then return early. Because we know that we're only ever going to send in strings as our first parameter. It's going to be music volume or FX volume. So if it's not a string, they send in a number or something, we just ignore it. So then we can check that the message is one that we expect. So we'll say if message is music volume or message is FX volume, then it is one that we expect, right? So that's good. But now we also want to know that the value, in fact, the type of the value, type of value is a number. Okay, that's good. Type of value is a number, and the value is greater or equal to 0, and the value is less than or equal to 1. And the reason for that is we don't want someone sending in the music volume as, 100 billion. Otherwise, it'll probably blow out their speaker. So that is good. So if we finally got all that, we can say profile message equals value, right? So if they send in music volume or FX volume, and they send in a valid number that is between 0 and 1, then we'll just update the profile with that value. And what that will do is it will store it into the profile service in our data script. That will all work. But if you recall, that will also fire a message because we've updated the profile, which will go through the factory's profile update thing, which fires it back to the client, which means that it will come back inside our data script. And we could do something with it here if we wanted to. But we don't because we've already set it on the client at that point inside our callback anyway. But one thing I have noticed is that when we get the first message, we don't actually update the volume. So we update the slider positions, but we don't do this yet. So let's just quickly put those things in here. So when we get the first data update, we make sure to set the client's volume directly with those values. So that's the FX volume, and this is the music volume. So there we go. I think that should work. And what we should see is that if I play the game now, actually, if I first save it to Roblox and then I play the game, we should see that our settings get loaded from whatever value it was before. So that actually worked. And we should be seeing that these things update as I scroll on the client. Yes, you can see that. But only when I let go does that tell the server about it once. So if I set these to full and I sort of stop the game and I play the game once more, we should see that those are loaded. Yep. And we should see that it's also updated the default value to be 1. Cool. So now we can turn them off. We can stop. And if I start again, they should be at 0. And they are. And our sound service is also set to 0. That is really neat. Cool. So I think we've accomplished quite a lot in this episode. We've basically updated our UI with some nice icons. And now we are able to click this thing and show our settings window, which has these sliders on. And then our code handles those sliders with our new UI controls module script that sort of hooks into the buttons press events, the move events, and the stop moving events to update data not only on the client side inside those sound groups, but also on the server side by sending a message over to the server, which we then validate and use to update the profile so that we can save it and load it next time. So that's it for this video. If you enjoyed it, like and subscribe, leave a comment, ring that notification bell, all that good stuff, and I will see you next time.